It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Sign the waiver, Bianca, Julian Morty demanded, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the Morty estate library. He leaned over the antique mahogany desk, the gold chains around his neck clinking against his silk Versace shirt. He didn't wait for her to respond before tossing a gold-plated Ferrari key fob onto the table, the heavy metal landing with a thud near her hand. You don't need the family estate to audit tax returns in a cubicle. Take the car and disappear before the board meeting. Bianca Morty sat perfectly still, her spine a rigid line against the velvet chair. She wore a charcoal wool blazer, bespoke and devoid of any visible logos, a stark contrast to the neon blue silk her brother favored. Her eyes tracked the movement of the key fob, but her expression remained as unreadable as a closed ledger. She could smell the cloying, heavy scent of his expensive oud cologne, a fragrance that screamed for attention in a room that had once smelled of old leather and her mother's jasmine perfume. The estate belongs to the head of the family, Julian, she said, her voice low and steady. Mother hasn't been gone for 48 hours. The ink on the death certificate isn't even dry. Which is exactly why you need to sign, Julian snapped. He turned to the corner of the room where Sophia Rossi stood, her smartphone held high. She was adjusted the ring light she'd brought into the sanctuary of their family home, her face painted in layers of heavy contour. Are we live, babe? 3,000 viewers and counting, Sophia chirped, flashing a rehearsed, dazzling smile at the lens. Everyone wants to see the new king of the Morty syndicate take his throne. Say hi to the fans, Bianca, or don't. You look a bit drab for camera. Julian chuckled, a harsh, entitled sound that grated against the quiet dignity of the room. He reached out and flicked the lapel of Bianca's jacket with a manicured finger. See, even Sophia knows you don't fit the brand. You've always been the sleeping Morty. Well, wake up and realize the dream is over. I've already had Marcus Sterling draft the transfer of power. It's a done deal. In the shadows near the floor-to-ceiling windows, Marcus Sterling shifted. The family consigliere remained a silhouette against the twilight, his presence a silent weight. He didn't speak, but the glint of his silver spectacles suggested he was watching Bianca closely. Bianca felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She reached into her modest leather handbag and touched the cool, brushed steel of her burner phone. Beneath it lay a digital recorder that had been running since she entered the room. Julian's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He assumed her silence was submission. He had no idea she had spent the last 3 years as a forensic auditor, not just for corporate firms, but for the very accounts he had been draining to fund his new mafia lifestyle. You buried her in a closed casket, Julian, Bianca said, her voice dropping an octave. No wake, no public viewing. You claimed it was her final wish to avoid prying eyes, but we both know Isabella loved the spotlight. Julian's eyes flashed with a momentary flicker of something, guilt, or perhaps just irritation at being questioned. He leaned in closer, his shadow looming over her. I did what was necessary to protect the transition. The matriarch is gone. I am the Morty legacy now. If you want to play grieving daughter, do it on your own time. Right now, you're an obstacle. He shoved the fountain pen toward her, the nib scratching harshly against the parchment of the waiver. Sign it, or I'll have Lorenzo Valli clean your apartment of everything you own. And I do mean everything, Bianca, including that pathetic little career you've built. Bianca looked at the pen, then up at Julian. She saw the greed in his eyes, the way he glanced at Sophia's camera, performing for an audience of strangers while their mother's body was supposedly cooling in a private vault. He didn't know that Bianca had seen Donna Isabella Morty only 3 hours ago, not in a casket, but in a secure safe house, very much alive and nursing a glass of Barolo. The plan was already in motion. Julian's death of the matriarch was a forged play for the inheritance, a move Donna Isabella had anticipated the moment Julian started buying gold-plated supercars with the syndicate's emergency reserves. I won't sign, Bianca said clearly. The room went icy. Sophia stopped posing, her jaw dropping as she checked the comments scrolling on her screen. Julian's face turned a mottled shade of purple, his nostrils flaring. "What did you say?" he hissed. "I said no." Bianca stood up, her movements fluid and calm. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like an apex predator who had finally decided to stop playing dead. She picked up the Ferrari keys and dropped them into the trash can beside the desk. The metallic clang echoed like a gunshot. Julian lunged forward, grabbing her arm, his grip bruising. "You little—" "Careful, Julian," Bianca whispered, leaning into his space. The scent of his fear was starting to override the oud. "The camera is still rolling. Do you really want your fans to see how the king treats his only sister?" Julian recoiled as if stung, glancing at Sophia, who was looking panicked. He smoothed his silk shirt, his hands trembling with suppressed rage. "Fine. You want to play it the hard way? You have 24 hours to vacate your office. By this time tomorrow, you'll be a nobody with a last name that doesn't mean a damn thing." Bianca didn't reply. She turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat against the marble floor. As she passed Marcus, the consigliere stepped forward, handing her a small, sealed envelope. His expression was a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes held a spark of recognition. She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy iron gates of the estate humming as they closed behind her. She climbed into her armored but unbranded SUV and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number she knew by heart. "Lorenzo," she said when the line picked up. "He took the bait. He's announcing the inheritance at the gala tomorrow night. And the documents." Lorenzo Valli's voice was a low, gravelly hum. "I have everything," Bianca said, looking back at the glowing lights of the mansion. "He thinks he's taking the throne. He has no idea I'm about to burn the palace down." She ended the call and watched the countdown timer on her dashboard. 23 hours and 59 minutes until the Morty Gala. 23 hours until Julian realized that the sister he had dismissed was the one who held the keys to his cage. The next morning, the air in the Morty penthouse office was thick with the scent of Julian's cloying, $500 cologne, a heavy, synthetic oud that seemed to coat the very walls. Bianca Morty stood in the doorway, her charcoal gray blazer perfectly tailored and buttoned, a sharp contrast to the chaotic opulence of the room. Julian Morty didn't even look up as his sister entered. He was slumped in their late father's leather chair, his feet, clad in gold-buckled loafers, propped up on the mahogany desk. He was busy signing a stack of liquidation papers with a gold-plated fountain pen, his silk Versace shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest to reveal a thick, gaudy chain. "You're late," he snapped, finally tossing the pen onto the desk. It skittered across the polished surface, narrowly missing a crystal carafe of scotch. "Not that it matters. I've already made the executive decisions. The Tuscany vineyard is being sold to a development group by noon." Bianca felt a cold prickle of rage. That vineyard had been their mother's sanctuary, the one place Donna Isabella Morty had felt truly at peace. "The vineyard isn't part of the liquid assets, Julian. It was specifically protected in the trust." He let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "The trust that I now control as the sole male heir? Don't be naive, Bianca. I need the capital. The Morty name needs a refresh, something with more teeth." He gestured vaguely toward the window, where his gold-plated Ferrari sat idling at the curb, its engine a low, arrogant thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. "You look like a funeral director in that charcoal rag." A high, melodic voice chimed from the corner. Sophia Rossi was perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, her phone held high as she adjusted her ring light. She didn't look up from her screen, her thumb flying across the glass as she replied to comments on her live stream. "Julian, tell her she needs to change before the gala. My followers won't engage if the background characters look like they're attending a wake." "She's right," Julian said, his eyes narrowing with a cruel sort of satisfaction. "You're a ghost, Bianca, a relic of a boring, modest era. I'm the one bringing this family into the light. Tonight at the gala, I'm announcing the full restructuring. By tomorrow, your little auditing department will be a memory." Bianca didn't flinch. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, brushed metal of the digital recorder. She had already activated it the moment she stepped off the elevator. She watched him sign the last document, a transfer of deed that she knew for a fact required a signature he didn't legally possess. "Are you sure about that, Julian?" she asked, her voice a calm, steady blade. "The board might have questions about the sudden liquidation of non-probate assets." "The board does what I tell them," he barked, standing up and leaning over the desk. The smell of the oud cologne intensified, sickeningly sweet. "I have the papers, I have the momentum, and most importantly, I have the name. You're just the sister we keep in the basement to count the pennies. Now get out, I have a legacy to build." Sophia giggled, blowing a kiss to her camera. "And don't forget to wear something expensive tonight, or at least something that doesn't scream middle management." Bianca turned without a word. The sharp click of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound in the hallway as she exited. She didn't look back at the office where her brother was currently laughing, pouring himself a drink to celebrate a victory that didn't exist. Once inside the elevator, she pulled out her phone. The screen glowed, showing a secure connection to Lorenzo Valley. She tapped a single command, uploading the recording of Julian's admission to the cloud. "He just signed the Tuscany transfer," she said quietly into her headset as the elevator descended. "He's using the forged seal." "Then he just walked into the trap," Lorenzo's gravelly voice replied. "The forensic trail is live. I've mapped the offshore accounts he's trying to funnel the sale into. It's all there, Bianca." She stepped out into the lobby, the cool morning air hitting her face. She looked at her watch. 10 hours until the Morty Gala. 10 hours until Julian stood on that stage in front of the city's elite to claim a throne built on sand. She climbed into her armored SUV, the heavy door closing with a satisfying, muted thud. She didn't need a gold-plated car to feel powerful. She had the truth, and in 10 hours, the truth was going to be the only thing Julian Morty couldn't buy his way out of. "Let him have his toast," Bianca whispered to the empty car, her eyes cold as flint. "It'll be the last thing he ever drinks as a free man." 4 hours had passed since Bianca left the glass and steel cage of the Morty Tower. Now, she stood in a place Julian didn't know existed, a sub-basement beneath an unassuming textile warehouse on the city's industrial fringe. The air here didn't smell of the forced lilies and expensive floor wax of the penthouse. It smelled of ozone, cold server racks, and the bitter, dark roast of espresso. It was the scent of work, not of theater. Lorenzo looked up from a semicircle of monitors, his face washed in the pale blue glow of scrolling data. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply tapped a key, and a high-resolution scan of a document filled the central screen. "The Tuscany transfer," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to hum in the small space. "He filed the digital copy through a shell company in Panama an hour ago. He thinks the encryption is military grade. It took me 6 minutes to bypass the gate." Bianca stepped closer, her fingers trailing over the edge of a steel table. She was still wearing her charcoal tailoring, the bespoke fabric feeling like armor against the humidity of the city. She didn't look at the numbers. She looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. "It's a beautiful forgery," a voice came from the shadows. Marcus Sterling stepped into the light, his silver hair catching the glow of the monitors. The family consigliere held a physical folder in his hands, his expression one of profound disappointment. "If I didn't know your mother was currently sitting in a safe house 3 miles from here, I might have believed it myself. The slant of the M, the slight hesitation on the final I, it's perfect. But," Bianca asked, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "But Julian is a creature of the present," Marcus said, laying the folder open. He pointed to a microscopic detail on the scan. "He used a ballpoint pen from the Morty 75th anniversary set. The ink contains a specific chemical marker, a synthetic polymer used to prevent fading. That ink didn't exist in 2019, which is the date he backdated this deed to. He signed his own confession in anniversary ink." Bianca felt a cold spark of satisfaction. Julian's arrogance had always been his greatest asset and his most glaring weakness. He was so convinced of his own brilliance that he neglected the granular truths that forensic auditors like her lived for. "He's not just moving the property," Lorenzo interrupted, swiping a new window onto the screen. "Look at this. He's using the deed as collateral for a short-term high-interest loan. He's liquidating everything he can touch before the gala tonight. He's planning to announce a massive expansion, but the books show he's actually hollowing out the core of the company." Suddenly, a notification pinged on a tablet resting on the table. It was a social media alert. Lorenzo tapped it, and the room was filled with the shrill, performative laughter of Sophia Rossi. The live stream showed the interior of a private jet cabin, though the plane was clearly still on the tarmac. Sophia was draped across a white leather seat, holding a bottle of champagne that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. "Can you believe it, guys?" Sophia chirped to her thousands of viewers, her eyes hidden behind oversized designer sunglasses. "Tonight is the night. Julian is finally taking his rightful place. No more dead weight, no more family traditions holding us back." The camera panned to show Julian in the background. He was shouting at a flight attendant because his suit hadn't been pressed to his exact specifications. He looked toward the camera, his face twisted in a sneer of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "Tell them the truth, Sophia," Julian barked, pointing a finger at the lens. "Tell them that by tomorrow, the Morty name will actually mean something again. I'm done playing nice with the ghost of my mother and that mouse of a sister. Bianca thinks she can hide in the basement and count pennies. Let her. I'm the one building the empire." He grabbed the champagne bottle from Sophia's hand and took a long swig, some of the vintage liquid spilling onto his silk tie. He didn't even notice. "Tonight, the board realizes who the real power is. And if Bianca shows up, security has orders to escort her to the kitchen. That's where the help belongs, right?" Sophia erupted into giggles, the sound grating against the silence of the war room. Lorenzo muted the screen, but the image of Julian's smug, wine-flushed face remained. The silence that followed was heavy. Bianca's nails dug into the palms of her hands, but her expression remained a mask of marble. She wasn't hurt. She was calibrated. "He's reaching his peak," she said quietly. "The higher he climbs, the more air there is for the fall." "The SEC tip is ready," Lorenzo said, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "The moment he steps onto that stage to announce the Tuscany expansion, I hit send. The forensic trail is mapped. The forged ink report is attached. Marcus has the live witness statements from the notary Julian bribed." "And my mother?" Bianca asked, turning to Marcus Sterling. "Donna Isabella is waiting," the older man replied. "She's seen the live stream. She's seen the forged death certificate he tried to file in the private archives. She's no longer mourning the son she lost, Bianca. She's preparing to face the monster she raised." Bianca picked up her phone. A text message had just arrived from Julian. It was a photo of her old desk at the office, now sitting in the hallway next to a trash can. "Cleaned out the clutter. Don't show up tonight, B. You'll only embarrass yourself. I've already told the board you've taken an indefinite leave for mental health. Stay in the shadows where you belong." She didn't delete the message. She saved it. It was the final piece of justification she needed. 6 hours, Bianca whispered, looking at the digital clock on the server rack. 6 hours until the Morty Gala begins. She turned to the exit, the heavy steel door hissing open. She could almost feel the weight of the city's expectations, the looming social slaughter that Julian was walking into with a smile on his face. He thought he was preparing for a coronation. He didn't realize she had already built the scaffold. "Lorenzo," she said, pausing at the threshold. "Release the first breadcrumb. Let the bank know there's an inconsistency in the Tuscany collateral. I want him receiving the first frantic phone calls while he's getting into his tuxedo." "With pleasure," Lorenzo replied. Bianca stepped out into the evening, the cool air hitting her face. The countdown had moved from days to hours. She climbed into her SUV, the door closing with a solid, final thud. Julian wanted her in the shadows? Fine. That was where the most lethal strikes always came from. 2 hours before the first limousine was scheduled to crest the long, winding driveway of the estate, The Morty mansion hummed with the frantic, jagged energy of a stage being set for a massacre. Bianca stood in the shadow of the grand staircase, her charcoal tailoring, bespoke, silent, and devoid of any visible logos, making her nearly invisible against the dark mahogany paneling. She watched the staff scurry under the sharp, barking orders of her brother. Julian Morty was a whirlwind of gold-leafed arrogance and unearned confidence. He was currently standing in the center of the foyer, his silk Versace suit shimmering under the crystal chandeliers like oil on water. He was screaming into a gold-plated smartphone, his face a mottled shade of plum that clashed violently with the festive decor. "I don't care what the regional manager said," Julian roared, his voice echoing off the marble floors. The sound of his heavy, gold-soled shoes paced a restless, angry circle. "The Tuscany collateral is solid. It's been solid for 30 years. If that bank freezes my line of credit tonight, of all nights, I will buy their entire branch just to fire everyone in it." He slammed the phone onto a silver tray held by a passing waiter, the clatter of metal on metal ringing out like a gunshot. The smell of his cologne, an overpowering, synthetic oud, filled the foyer, thick enough to choke the scent of the thousands of fresh lilies lining the hall. Bianca stepped forward, her movements fluid and controlled. She didn't make a sound until she was within his peripheral vision. "You seem agitated, Julian," she said, her voice a cool, steady blade that cut through his frantic heat. Julian spun around, his eyes narrowing as they raked over her modest attire. He let out a sharp, derisive snort. "And you look like a charity case. I told you to wear the emeralds, Bianca. Instead, you show up looking like a forensic accountant at a funeral." He stepped closer, invading her space, the heat of his frustration radiating off him. "But I suppose it's fitting. You've always had a talent for being a buzzkill." "I'm merely concerned about the Tuscany files," Bianca replied, her expression a mask of placid indifference. She adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, feeling the subtle weight of the encrypted drive hidden in her inner pocket. "Errors in collateral have a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. Arrogance is a poor shield against a paper trail." Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that held no mirth. "Paper trails are for people who can't afford to burn them. I am the head of this family now. I am the one who signs the checks, which means I am the one who decides what the truth is." He reached out, flicking the lapel of her charcoal jacket with a sneer. "Go hide in the corner with the rest of the help, Bianca. Tonight is my coronation. Don't let your jealousy stain the carpet." Behind them, the heavy front doors swung open. Sophia Rossi floated in, her phone already held high on a gimbal, the ring light reflecting in her eyes like a predator S. "Julian, darling, we're live," she chirped, her voice dripping with performative sweetness. "The followers are dying to see the new king of the Morty Empire." Julian's transformation was instantaneous. The rage vanished, replaced by a gleaming, predatory smile as he turned toward the camera. He pulled Sophia into his side, his hand gripping her waist with a possessive force. "Tell them the Empire has never been in better hands," Julian bragged, casting one last dismissive glance over his shoulder at Bianca. "Some people are born to lead, and some are born to watch from the sidelines." Sophia giggled, the sound like breaking glass, and panned the camera away from Bianca as if she didn't exist. From the upstairs landing, Marcus Sterling watched the exchange. The family consigliere remained motionless, his hands clasped behind his back. He caught Bianca's gaze for a fleeting second. He saw the absolute stillness in her eyes, the look of a predator that had already scented blood. He didn't say a word, but he adjusted his glasses, a silent acknowledgement of the storm he knew was about to break. Bianca turned away from the bright lights of the live stream, walking toward the darkened library. She pulled her phone from her pocket and sent a single two-word text to Lorenzo Valli. Phase 2. She sat in the darkness of the library, the cool leather of the chair grounding her as the first sounds of arriving engines began to rumble in the distance. The countdown had reached its final hour. Julian was out there, basking in the glow of 1,000 digital eyes, completely unaware that the foundation of his world was already turned to ash. She leaned back, listening to the music start to play in the ballroom, a slow, predatory smile finally touching her lips. The gala was beginning, and Julian was walking into his own wake. The evening arrived with a suffocating layer of opulence that felt more like a shroud than a celebration. By 8 o'clock, the Morty estate was transformed into a cathedral of glass and gold, illuminated by thousands of flickering candles that cast long, predatory shadows against the marble walls. The air was thick with the scent of imported gardenias and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Julian Morty stood at the center of the rotunda, a vision of new mafia, excess in a silk, suit the color of a fresh bruise, accented by a gold-plated watch that caught every flash of the photographer's cameras. He held court with the air of a king already crowned, his laughter booming over the string quartet. Beside him, Sophia Rossi preened for her smartphone, her live-streaming light ring creating a halo of artificial perfection around her face as she narrated the night to her millions of followers. "And here he is, the man of the hour," Sophia chirped into her phone, her voice like shattered glass. "Julian is about to take the Morty legacy to heights his mother never dreamed of. Isn't that right, babe?" Julian smirked, his eyes scanning the room for more important prey. "My mother was a woman of the past, Sophia. Tonight, we embrace the future." Bianca Morty stepped into the ballroom exactly 10 minutes after the final guest had arrived. She didn't use the grand staircase. She emerged from the side gallery, her presence a silent, charcoal-colored strike against the garish gold of the room. Her bespoke tailoring was sharp enough to draw blood, devoid of logos or glitter, projecting a silent power that made the socialites in their sequins look like costumed children. She felt the weight of the encrypted drive in her clutch, a small, cold rectangle of justice. Every step she took on the polished floor echoed with the rhythm of a countdown. "Look what the cat dragged in," Julian called out, his voice carrying across the silent pockets of the room. He didn't move toward her. He waited for her to come to him, a classic power play that Bianca met with a slow, measured gait. "I thought I told you to stay in the library, Bianca. This isn't a place for accountants and shadows." "You're dampening the mood." A few of Julian's sycophants chuckled. Sophia didn't stop filming, turning her lens toward Bianca with a predatory glint. "Oh, look, the help has arrived. Bianca, dear, is that the same suit you wore to the funeral, or do you just have a closet full of mourning?" Bianca didn't flinch. She stopped 3 feet from Julian, her gaze level and unnervingly still. The smell of his cologne, something heavy and cloying, tried to invade her space, but she remained an island of composure. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Julian," Bianca said, her voice a calm contrast to his performative volume. "Is that so?" Julian stepped closer, invading her personal space, his breath smelling of aged scotch. He reached out, flicking the lapel of her charcoal jacket with a sneer. "You look like a ghost. But then again, you've always been good at playing dead while I do the real work. Just remember whose name is on the invitations tonight. Mine. I am the Morty head now." He turned back to his audience, raising his crystal flute. "A toast to legacy, to the will that finally put the right man in charge." The room erupted in cheers, but Bianca's eyes drifted toward the back of the hall. Marcus Sterling stood there, the family consigliere, his face a mask of stone. Beside him, Lorenzo Valli leaned against a pillar, his hands in his pockets, his eyes never leaving Julian's throat. Lorenzo caught Bianca's gaze and gave a microscopic nod. The digital perimeter was set. Julian, fueled by the adoration and the alcohol, climbed the 3 steps of the dais where a large projector screen had been set up to display the new corporate branding for the Morty Empire. He was peak arrogance now, chest puffed out, a man who believed he had successfully buried his mother and sidelined his sister. "Before we begin the main event," Julian announced, his voice amplified by the hidden speakers, "I want to talk about sacrifice. My mother, Donna Isabella Morty, was a titan, but even titans fall. Her passing left a void that only a vision like mine can fill." He paused for dramatic effect, wiping a non-existent tear from his eye. It was a masterclass in sociopathic theater. Bianca watched from the edge of the crowd, her fingers tracing the edge of her phone in her pocket. "Julian," Bianca called out, not loud, but the clarity of her tone cut through the murmurs of the crowd like a razor. Julian stopped, his hand on the remote for the projector. He looked down at her, his face twisting into a mask of annoyed condescension. "Not now, Bianca. Go find a corner to hide in. I'm in the middle of a tribute." "You should be careful with tributes," Bianca said, stepping into the center of the floor, the light from the chandeliers reflecting in her dark eyes. "Sometimes the dead have a way of speaking for themselves." Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "You finally snapped. The grief has rotted your brain. Security, please escort my sister to her rooms. She's making a scene." Two large men in suits started to move toward her, but Marcus Sterling stepped into their path with a single, authoritative look that froze them in their tracks. The room went unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the low hum of the projector and the frantic tapping of Sophia's fingers as she checked her live stream engagement. "I'm not leaving, Julian," Bianca said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming the cold wind before a storm. "And neither are you. Not until everyone here sees exactly what kind of sacrifice you've made." Julian's thumb whitened against the remote. His arrogance was a shield, but for the first time a hairline fracture appeared in his expression. He looked at Marcus, then at the silent, watching crowd. He felt the shift in the room, the transition from a party to a trial. "I have the will, Bianca," Julian hissed, leaning over the podium, his voice intended only for her. "I have the signatures, I have the power. You have nothing but a charcoal suit and a grudge." "I have the truth," Bianca replied, her smile finally touching her lips, a predatory, lethal thing. "And in 10 seconds, so will the world." She tapped a single command on her phone. On the giant screen behind Julian, the corporate logo flickered, distorted, and then vanished. In its place, a high-definition video feed began to buffer. Julian turned, his face pale against the blue light of the screen. He expected a glitch. He expected a technical error. He didn't expect to see the interior of a private medical suite. He didn't expect to see the woman sitting in the high-backed chair, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes as sharp as the diamonds on her fingers. The room gasped as one. The sound of 100 hearts skipping a beat echoed in the silence. Donna Isabella Morty looked directly into the camera, and by extension, directly at her son. Julian's hand began to shake, the crystal flute in his other hand trembling until the champagne spilled over his knuckles, staining his silk sleeve. He looked at the screen, then at Bianca, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Wait for it," Bianca whispered, her voice a ghost in the silence of the Cathedral of Lies. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer respectful. It was suffocating. The high-definition image of Donna Isabella Morty pulsed on the massive screens, her steady breathing the only sound in a room filled with the city's elite. Julian stood frozen, the crystal flute finally slipping from his nerveless fingers. It shattered against the white marble, a sharp, violent crack that made the front row of socialites flinch. Champagne splashed across his hand-stitched leather shoes, but he didn't seem to feel the cold. Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to structurally fail. The arrogant sneer he'd worn like armor for months curdled into a mask of raw, animalistic terror. His jaw unhinged, hanging slack as his lips took on a sickly, bluish tint. A fine sheen of cold sweat broke across his brow, catching the blue light of the screen and making him look like a wax figure melting under a spotlight. His eyes, once darting with predatory calculation, were now blown wide, the pupils swallowing the irises as he stared at the ghost of the woman he'd buried in a hollow casket. Every muscle in his neck corded with the strain of a scream that refused to come, his throat working in dry, clicking swallows. He looked less like a king, and more like a man watching the floor vanish beneath his feet. "Mother," Julian finally managed, the word a pathetic, strangled croak. "Not quite, Julian," Bianca said, her voice cutting through the heavy air like a scalpel. She stepped forward, the charcoal fabric of her suit absorbing the light where his silk reflected it. She looked at him not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a judge reading a foregone verdict. Ghosts don't have heartbeats, and they certainly don't sign affidavits. Marcus Sterling stepped out from behind the velvet curtains, clutching a thick leather portfolio. The family consigliere didn't look at the man he had served for the last 3 months. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on Bianca. The forensic audit is complete, Julian. Every offshore transfer, every forged signature on the medical directives, and the GPS coordinates of the private clinic where you kept your mother drugged while you planned her funeral. It's all here. The room erupted in a wave of jagged whispers. Sophia Rossi, who had been preening for her live stream only moments ago, didn't move to comfort her fiancé. Instead, she took a deliberate step back, her eyes wide as she realized the camera was still rolling, capturing Julian's collapse for 3 million viewers. She didn't drop the phone. She adjusted the angle to get a better shot of his trembling hands. "This is a lie!" Julian shrieked, his voice cracking as he turned toward the crowd, looking for an ally. Bianca is a failed auditor. She's jealous. She's trying to steal the Morty legacy. He reached out to grab the arm of a senior board member, a man who had been his father's closest friend. The older man recoiled, pulling his sleeve away as if Julian's touch were corrosive. "The legacy ended the moment you put a living woman in the ground, boy," the board member spat. Bianca felt a cold, sharp satisfaction settle in her chest. She reached into her inner pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive. She didn't need to shout. The room was so quiet she could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "I didn't just watch you, Julian. I audited you. While you were buying gold-plated Ferraris with the company's pension fund, Lorenzo Valli was tracing every cent back to the accounts you thought were invisible." She walked toward him, the rhythmic click of her heels the only rhythm in the room. Julian backed away until his calves hit the edge of the stage. He looked small. He looked cheap. "You told me I didn't belong in this world," she whispered, leaning in so only he could hear the ice in her tone. "You said I was a guest in your house, but the deed to this estate, the voting shares of the firm, and the keys to the Morty vaults, they never belonged to a traitor." She turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the enablers and the sycophants who had cheered for Julian's rise. "The Morty family is under new management, effective immediately." Bianca didn't wait for his response. She didn't stay to watch the police, who were already stepping through the foyer doors, their handcuffs glinting under the chandeliers. She simply turned her back on the wreckage of his life and walked toward the exit. "Wait!" Julian screamed, his voice breaking into a sob. "Bianca, we're blood." She stopped at the heavy oak doors, looking back one last time. "Blood is for family, Julian. You're just a bad debt I've finally cleared." She stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the sound of his begging behind. The lion wasn't sleeping anymore. She was just getting started. The chaos inside the ballroom was a symphony of falling glass and shattered egos. 10 minutes had passed since Bianca Morty had walked out of the double oak doors, but the vacuum she left behind was filled with the predatory hum of a trap finally closing. Julian Morty stood in the center of the room, his silk Versace jacket suddenly feeling like a shroud. He looked toward the board members, his mouth working silently, like a fish gasping for air on a dry dock. Julian's features seemed to liquefy under the harsh glare of the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. The arrogance that usually defined his jawline had collapsed into a trembling, grayish mess of loose skin and panic. Sweat beaded on his upper lip, turning his expensive foundation into a streaky, oily mask of desperation that caught the light in all the wrong ways. His eyes, once predatory and sharp, now darted like trapped insects, wide and bloodshot as they fixed on the approaching officers. The veins in his neck pulsed with a frantic, rhythmic throb, looking as though they might burst through his gold-threaded collar at any moment. "This is a mistake," he finally shrieked, the sound cracking in the cavernous space. He turned to Marcus Sterling, reaching out a hand that shook so violently his diamond ring clattered against his champagne flute. "Marcus, tell them. My sister is delusional. She's been bitter since the inheritance. She's forged those documents." Marcus Sterling didn't move. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, His charcoal suit a stark, professional contrast to Julian's gaudy gold-plated accessories. The consigliere looked at the younger man not with anger, but with the cold, clinical detachment one might reserve for a ledger error. The documents were verified by the syndicate's own forensic auditors, Julian, Marcus said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. And the testimony regarding your mother's death came from a source you clearly underestimated. The Morty line doesn't tolerate those who trade in ghosts. The sound of a camera shutter clicked nearby. Sophia Rossi was no longer standing by Julian's side. She had retreated several feet, her gold phone held high, recording the entire collapse for her millions of followers. When Julian looked at her, pleading for support, she simply adjusted her lighting. "Don't look at me, Jules," she said, her voice dripping with a new, icy pragmatism. "I have a brand to protect. I can't be associated with a fraud who can't even manage his own bank accounts." She turned the camera toward the police. "You guys are getting this, right? Total betrayal. I'm literally shaking." The rage spike hit Julian like a physical blow. He lunged toward her, but a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. Lorenzo Valli, the man Julian had once called his cleaner, stepped out of the shadows. Lorenzo didn't say a word. He simply applied a pressure to Julian's collarbone that forced the younger man to his knees. The smell of Lorenzo's leather jacket, cold and smelling of rain, filled Julian's senses, a reminder that the syndicate's protection had officially expired. "Wait," Julian wheezed, his knees hitting the marble with a sickening thud. "I have money. I have the offshore accounts in the Caymans. Lorenzo, I can triple whatever she's paying you." "You have nothing," a voice echoed from the foyer. Bianca walked back into the room. She hadn't left the building. She had simply waited for the initial shock to settle into the reality of the reckoning. She moved through the crowd of board members who parted for her like a dark tide. She stopped 3 feet from her brother, looking down at the man who had tried to bury their mother alive for a seat at a table he didn't own. "The offshore accounts were seized at 8:00 p.m. tonight," Bianca said, her voice calm and terrifyingly level. "Lorenzo didn't just track the transfers, he redirected them. Every cent you stole to fund this circus has been returned to the Morty estate." She leaned down, the scent of her modest, woodsy perfume cutting through the cloying smell of Julian's expensive cologne and cold sweat. "You told me I was a guest in this house," she whispered, loud enough for Marcus and the officers to hear. "But a guest can be asked to leave. A thief, however, is escorted." Julian looked up at her, his lips trembling. "Bianca, please, we're blood. You can't do this to your own brother. You stopped being my brother the moment you signed Mom's death certificate while she was still breathing," she replied. She stood up straight, her charcoal tailoring sharp and unyielding. "Officer, he's all yours." The forgery, the embezzlement, and the conspiracy charges are all detailed in the folder Marcus is holding. The metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs was the only sound in the ballroom. Julian didn't fight as they pulled him up. He looked small, the gold-plated Ferrari keys in his pocket now just useless pieces of metal. As he was led toward the exit, the board members, the same people who had laughed at his jokes and toasted his rise, turned their backs. They began to cluster around Bianca, their faces masks of sudden, sycophantic loyalty. Bianca didn't acknowledge them. She watched Julian disappear through the doors, his muffled protests fading into the night air. She felt the weight of the last 5 years finally begin to shift. Lorenzo stepped up beside her, his eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. "It's done," he murmured. "No," Bianca said, her gaze fixing on Marcus Sterling, who held a second, thinner envelope in his hand. "The house is clean, Lorenzo. Now we start on the syndicate." She turned and walked toward the private study, leaving the vultures in the ballroom to realize that the lion wasn't just back, she was hungry. Julian was alone in the back of a squad car, but the real war for the Morty legacy had only just begun. The night Julian was led away in handcuffs, the Morty estate didn't fall into chaos. It fell into a deep, surgical silence. Marcus Sterling spent the following hours in the library, notarizing the documents that officially returned every stolen sent to the family's legitimate accounts. While Julian sat in a sterile interrogation room, his frantic protests falling on deaf ears, Lorenzo Valli was already executing a digital purge, erasing Julian's access to the syndicate's offshore layers. Sophia Rossi didn't even wait for the bail hearing. She was seen at the airport by dawn, her designer luggage stuffed with the last of Julian's liquid assets she could grab before the accounts froze. The new mafia empire hadn't just collapsed. It had been liquidated before the sun rose. Bianca stood on the balcony of the study, watching the city lights, knowing the easy part was over. 6 months had passed since the name Morty was synonymous with Julian's gilded arrogance. Bianca adjusted the cuff of her bespoke charcoal blazer, the fabric cool and structured against her skin. She sat in the corner office of the Morty Tower, a space that now smelled of expensive cedar and fresh espresso, rather than the cloying, over-applied cologne Julian had favored. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but she didn't spend her time staring at the horizon. She had a legacy to rebuild, and the syndicate's rot went deeper than one man's greed. Her phone buzzed with a discreet notification from Lorenzo. He had sent a photo, a grainy surveillance shot from a bus stop 3 miles away. In it, a man sat on a rusted metal bench, his shoulders hunched against the drizzling rain. It was Julian. Gone were the silk Versace suits and the gold-plated watches. He was wearing a faded, off-brand tracksuit that looked 2 sizes too large, his hair unstyled and thinning at the crown. He looked like a ghost of the man who had once poured wine over her dress and laughed at her poverty in front of the board. The self-proclaimed king was now a man who spent his afternoons at the public library because it was the only place with free heating. His Ferrari had been seized by the state, his penthouse auctioned off to cover his mounting legal fees, and his fiancée had blocked his number the moment the first indictment was unsealed. He had tried to sue for a portion of the inheritance, but Marcus had buried him in a mountain of forgery evidence that threatened to turn his suspended sentence into a decade in a maximum security cell. Bianca felt no surge of joy at the image. She felt a profound, heavy sense of order. "He's asking for a meeting again," Lorenzo said, stepping into the office. He didn't need to knock anymore. He wore a simple black turtleneck, his movements as silent as his reputation. He stood by the mahogany desk, his eyes scanning the security reports. "No," Bianca replied, her voice steady and devoid of malice. "There's nothing left to say. He chose his path when he signed our mother's death certificate while she was still breathing." "The board is asking about the final merger," Lorenzo added, his gaze shifting to the digital terminal. "They're eager to please now. The sycophants have found a new sun to orbit." "Let them wait," she said. She stood and walked toward the private elevator that led to the residential floors of the estate. "I have an appointment." She found Donna Isabella in the rooftop garden, the older woman's silver hair caught in the afternoon breeze. The matriarch was pruning a row of white roses, her hands steady and sure. For months, the world had believed her dead, and even now her presence was a secret shared only by those who had proven their absolute loyalty. The air here was sweet, filled with the scent of damp earth and blooming flora. "He looks like your father did," Isabella murmured without looking up from a stubborn stem. When the pride finally turned to poison, all that fire turned to ash. "He looks like a man who never learned the price of anything," Bianca said, stepping beside her. She reached out, touching the soft, cool petal of a blooming rose. The texture was like silk, a sharp contrast to the cold steel of the life she led downstairs. "And you, Bianca," Isabella turned, her dark eyes searching her daughter's face. "What was your price?" Bianca looked out over the empire she now commanded. She had the chair, the accounts, and the fear of the syndicate. She had her mother back from the grave. But when she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the forensic auditor who believed the world could be solved with a simple balance sheet. She saw a woman who knew exactly how much it cost to bury a brother while he was still walking. "I lost the girl who thought blood was a sanctuary," Bianca said quietly. The sound of the city hummed below them, a distant, rhythmic pulse of traffic and life. It was a reminder that the world moved on, regardless of who sat on the throne. Julian was a footnote now, a cautionary tale whispered in the back rooms of clubs he could no longer enter. As the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting long, charcoal shadows across the garden, Bianca turned back toward the office. There were more files to review, more debts to collect, and a syndicate that still needed a steady hand to guide it. She had won, but the victory felt like the tailoring she wore, perfectly fitted, undeniably powerful, and incredibly cold. She walked back inside, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind her, sealing out the wind and the ghost of the family she used to have.
I hope you enjoyed this wild story. Don't forget to subscribe for more. See you in the next one.